Welcome back, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, take a moment to slow down, settle in, and imagine a world that feels familiar but behaves very differently from our own. A world where silence carried weight, where patience was a daily skill, and where communication did not live in your pocket, but waited for you, bolted firmly to the wall. Tonight, we are stepping back into the 1950s, a time when the telephone was not smart, portable, or forgiving. It was heavy, immovable, and deeply serious business. In the modern world, phones are everywhere. They buzz, glow, vibrate, and interrupt without apology. We answer them half asleep, half distracted, sometimes without even looking at the screen. Calls come and go without ceremony. But in the 1950s, the telephone was something else entirely. It was not just a tool, it was an event. When the phone rang, the house responded. The phones themselves were physical objects in the truest sense. Made of thick plastic and solid metal parts, they had real weight. Picking up a receiver felt like lifting responsibility itself. These phones sat in fixed locations, often mounted to a wall in the kitchen or hallway, places chosen not for comfort or privacy, but for oversight. There was no wandering off to another room, no pacing outside, no escaping the presence of others. The phone belonged to the household, not the individual. Because of this, the telephone carried social meaning far beyond its function. It was a symbol of connection, yes, but also of discipline, respect, and reputation. Owning a phone was a privilege. Using it incorrectly was a social risk. Every ring was a small announcement to the household, something important was happening, and everyone was expected to behave accordingly. When the phone rang, people did not rush to grab it. They paused. They straightened their posture. They adjusted their voice before even touching the receiver. There was a belief earnestly held that the person on the other end could hear not just your words, but your attitude. Calmness mattered. Cheerfulness mattered. Control mattered. The phone did not tolerate carelessness. This seriousness came from the role the telephone played in everyday life. In the 1950s, it was often the only fast way to receive urgent news. Letters took days. Visits required planning. The phone connected households to doctors, schools, employers, and extended family. A ringing phone could mean good news, troubling news, or something that demanded immediate attention. You never knew which it would be. As a result, answering the phone casually was unthinkable. You did not treat it as background noise. You treated it like a knock at the front door, one that demanded readiness and respect. Even children were taught this early. They were trained not just to answer the phone, but to perform the answer correctly, as if they were representatives of the entire household. Because, in a way, they were. The phone also demanded patience. There was no instant redial, no voicemail, no missed call notifications. If you were not home, you missed the call. If someone else was using the line, you waited. If the call did not go through, you tried again later. Communication happened on the phone's terms, not yours. That limitation shaped behavior. People planned their calls. They chose their words carefully. They respected time because time on the phone was shared. Even the sound of the phone mattered. The ring was loud, sharp, and impossible to ignore. It cut through conversations, meals, and quiet moments alike. When it rang, everything else stopped. The sound itself carried authority. It commanded attention in a way modern notifications no longer do. Because the phone was such a central object, it naturally became a focal point of household life. Family schedules were shaped around it. Conversations paused for it. Arguments could start over it. And everyone understood that misuse, being careless, rude, or inconsiderate, reflected poorly not just on the caller, but on the entire family. This is why the phone in the 1950s inspired rules. Many rules. Some written, some unspoken, all enforced by social expectation. You did not need a manual to know that the phone was serious. You learned it by watching others, by being corrected, by sensing the tension in the room when it rang at the wrong time or for the wrong reason. Compared to today, it may sound excessive. But in a world with fewer distractions and fewer channels of communication, the telephone carried enormous weight. It was the fastest line to the outside world, and therefore it demanded care. Every call mattered. Every ring meant something. And every interaction carried the potential for judgment. This seriousness also gave the phone a strange kind of power. It could interrupt dinner. It could summon urgency. It could shift the mood of an entire evening. It was one of the few objects in the home that could instantly pull attention away from everything else. That power was respected, even feared, in small ways. Over time, this respect hardened into etiquette. Proper behavior was not optional. It was expected. To ignore the phone, mishandle it, or treat it lightly was to signal something about your character. The phone became a test not of technology, but of self-control, manners, and social awareness. And that is what makes the 1950s telephone so fascinating. It was not just a device, it was a mirror. It reflected how people saw themselves and how they wanted to be seen. Calm, polite, responsible, presentable, ready. Tonight, as we move deeper into this world of carefully measured greetings, shared phone lines, and unspoken rules, keep this in mind: the seriousness of the telephone was not about the phone itself. It was about what it represented: a connection to others, governed by restraint, patience, and the quiet pressure of being watched. So take a breath, imagine the weight of the receiver in your hand, and listen for the ring. Because in the 1950s, answering the phone was never just answering a call. It was stepping onto a stage where every word mattered, and every pause was noticed. And this was only the beginning. In the 1950s, answering the telephone was never a casual, thoughtless action. It was a moment loaded with meaning, expectation, and quiet pressure. When the phone rang, it was not simply a sound demanding attention, it was a call that pulled the entire household into a brief public performance. The person who reached the receiver first did not just represent themselves. They represented their family, their upbringing, and their place within the community. Unlike today, where phones are personal objects carried in pockets, the telephone of the 1950s belonged to the household as a whole. It usually sat in a shared space mounted on a kitchen wall, resting on a hallway table, or placed in the living room where everyone could hear it ring. When it rang, everyone knew. Children paused their play, adults stopped their conversations, and someone was expected to answer promptly and correctly. Letting the phone ring too long could appear careless or discourteous, as if the household did not value communication or respect the caller's time. The simple act of saying hello carried more weight than it does today. Tone mattered deeply. A greeting that sounded bored, rushed, annoyed, or confused could be judged harshly, especially in close-knit neighborhoods. People believed that tone revealed character. A clear, polite, and confident greeting suggested good manners and proper upbringing. A sloppy or impatient one hinted at laziness or poor discipline. In this way, the telephone became an extension of social reputation. Children were often taught specific rules about answering the phone. Many parents insisted that children should not answer at all unless they had been trained to do so properly. If they were allowed, they were expected to speak clearly, avoid slang, and never sound playful or distracted. Laughing into the receiver, chewing food, or speaking too loudly could embarrass the entire household. For families concerned about social standing, the phone was no place for informality. Adults, too, felt the pressure. Even in the privacy of their own homes, they adjusted their voices before lifting the receiver. People straightened their posture, cleared their throats, and prepared themselves mentally. There was a common belief that your physical attitude affected how your voice sounded. Sitting upright, speaking slowly, and smiling slightly were thought to project warmth and respect even though the caller could not see you. This sense of formality came partly from uncertainty. Caller ID did not exist, and the ringing phone was always a mystery. It could be a relative, a neighbor, an employer, or someone of higher social status. Because of this, every call was treated as potentially important. Answering casually risked offending someone who mattered. The safest option was always politeness. In many households, the first words spoken into the phone followed a predictable pattern. Some families answered with, "Just hello," while others included the family name. This practice reassured the caller that they had reached the correct home and immediately established clarity. It also reinforced the idea that the call was entering a shared family space, not a private one. The seriousness of answering the phone was also shaped by the slower pace of communication at the time. Calls were not constant. People did not receive dozens of calls a day. Each ring stood out and demanded attention. Because calls were fewer, they felt more significant. Ignoring one or answering poorly carried greater social risk. There was also a sense that the telephone connected the home to the outside world in a very direct way. When someone answered, they were opening a line between private domestic life and public society. That boundary felt fragile. Families worked hard to present themselves well, even in moments as brief as a greeting. Mistakes were remembered. In small communities, stories traveled quickly. If someone was known to answer the phone rudely or carelessly, it could become part of their reputation. Neighbors talked. Relatives commented. Over time, these small moments added up, shaping how a household was perceived. Gender roles played a part as well. Women, especially homemakers, were often expected to answer the phone during the day. Their voice became the primary public voice of the household. This placed additional pressure on them to sound pleasant, organized, and attentive. A calm and polite tone suggested a well-run home. A stressed or sharp tone could be interpreted as a sign of disorder. Men, on the other hand, often answered evening calls, especially those related to work. Their greeting was expected to sound steady and confident. The telephone, in this way, reinforced traditional roles and expectations without anyone explicitly stating them. Even silence mattered. Pausing too long before speaking, sounding confused, or asking "Who is this?" too bluntly could feel awkward or impolite. People were trained, socially if not formally, to move smoothly through the opening moments of a call. These unwritten rules were learned through observation, correction, and quiet embarrassment. What makes this ritual especially striking today is how invisible it has become. Modern phone etiquette is loose and personal. People answer while walking, eating, or multitasking. Missed calls are common and rarely taken personally. But in the 1950s, answering the phone was a moment that demanded focus and care. The telephone was not just a tool. It was a test. Each ring offered a brief opportunity to confirm that you and your family understood the rules of polite society. In a world where reputation mattered deeply and communication was limited, even a single word spoken into a black-corded receiver could carry more meaning than we might imagine now. This ritualized approach to answering the phone reveals something broader about life in the 1950s. It was a time when boundaries between private and public life were thinner, when community judgment was more immediate, and when everyday actions carried social weight. The telephone did not create these values, but it amplified them, turning an ordinary greeting into a quiet performance of respect, order, and identity. By understanding how seriously people took this small moment, we gain insight into a world where communication was slower, voices mattered more, and even the simplest hello could speak volumes. One of the most surprising aspects of telephone life in the 1950s was how little privacy people truly had. In many towns and rural areas, households did not have their own dedicated phone line. Instead, several families were connected to a single shared circuit known as a party line. This arrangement reduced costs and expanded access, but it came with an unspoken understanding: when you picked up the phone, you were never truly alone. A party line meant that multiple homes were physically linked to the same wire. If one household was on a call, others could hear faint voices or clicks when they lifted their receivers. While there were rules discouraging listening in, enforcement was nearly impossible. Curiosity often won. The temptation to pause, stay quiet, and listen was simply too strong for some people. Because of this, every phone call carried an awareness of an invisible audience. Conversations were carefully shaped, words chosen cautiously, and topics limited to what felt safe to share. Personal disagreements, sensitive family matters, or emotional discussions were often postponed or avoided entirely. The telephone was not a private confessional. It was a semi-public stage. People learned to recognize the sounds of their neighbors' calls. Over time, voices became familiar. A certain laugh, a distinctive tone, or a repeated phrase could give away who was speaking. Even without names, listeners could piece together stories. This turned the party line into a quiet source of neighborhood knowledge. Gossip thrived in this environment. Information traveled quickly, sometimes faster than intended. A casual comment overheard during a call could become a topic of conversation later that day. In small communities, these fragments of overheard dialogue helped shape opinions, relationships, and reputations. To cope with this lack of privacy, families developed strategies. Some waited until late hours to make important calls, hoping fewer people would be listening. Others spoke in vague language, using codes or indirect references that only the intended listener would understand. Certain topics were reserved strictly for face-to-face conversations, where walls felt more secure than wires. The presence of party lines also influenced behavior during calls. Silence became meaningful. If someone picked up their receiver and heard another call already in progress, etiquette demanded that they quietly hang up. Staying on the line was considered rude, even if it was difficult to prove. At the same time, everyone knew that not all listeners followed the rules. This system created a strange balance between trust and suspicion. Neighbors depended on one another to share the line responsibly, yet many assumed that someone might be listening at any moment. This tension shaped how people spoke, what they shared, and how open they felt. Children grew up understanding these boundaries early. They were warned not to repeat what they heard and reminded that phone conversations were not private. This lesson extended beyond the telephone, reinforcing broader ideas about discretion and restraint in public life. The party line also blurred the line between community and intrusion. On one hand, it connected people. It created a shared experience and reinforced a sense of closeness. On the other hand, it limited personal freedom and encouraged quiet surveillance. Everyone knew a little more about everyone else than they might have wanted. Conflicts sometimes arose when one household used the phone too often or for too long. Because the line was shared, one person's conversation blocked others from making calls. This could cause frustration, especially if someone needed the phone for something important. Polite reminders were common, but resentment could build over time. In emergencies, the party line revealed both its strengths and weaknesses. Neighbors could quickly become aware that something was wrong, but crowded lines could also delay urgent calls. This added another layer of tension to an already imperfect system. Looking back, the idea of sharing a phone line feels almost unimaginable. Modern communication is built on personal devices, private numbers, and encrypted messages. Yet for many families in the 1950s, the party line was normal. It shaped how people spoke, how they trusted, and how they understood privacy. This shared experience highlights a broader truth about life at the time. Privacy was not assumed. It was managed carefully. Communication required awareness, patience, and restraint. The party line was not just a technical solution, it was a social environment that influenced behavior in subtle, but lasting ways. Understanding this helps explain why telephone etiquette mattered so much. When others might be listening, every word carried extra weight. The phone was not just a connection between two people. It was a thread woven through the entire neighborhood, binding households together whether they liked it or not. In the 1950s, time carried a different kind of weight, especially in the evening. Daily life followed predictable rhythms shaped by work schedules, household routines, and social expectations. Because of this structure, the telephone was expected to respect time boundaries just as people did. Calling someone too late in the evening was not simply inconvenient, it was seen as a violation of social order. For many families, evenings were the only quiet part of the day. Dinner was finished, children were preparing for bed, and adults were finally settling into rest after long hours of work. Radios played softly, newspapers were folded, and conversations slowed. When the phone rang during this time, it disrupted more than silence. It interrupted a carefully protected moment of calm. The widely accepted rule was simple: do not call after 8:00 p.m. unless the situation was truly important. This guideline was rarely written down, yet almost everyone understood it. Breaking this rule signaled a lack of awareness or consideration. It suggested that the caller valued their own needs over the household routines of others. Part of this expectation came from the physical nature of phones themselves. Telephones rang loudly, with sharp mechanical bells designed to be heard throughout the house. There was no vibration mode, no silent alert, no way to discreetly ignore the call without everyone noticing. A late-night ring startled children, woke light sleepers, and drew immediate attention from the entire household. Because of this, late calls often created tension before the receiver was even lifted. Family members exchanged glances, wondering who would call at such an hour and why. The assumption was rarely positive. Late calls suggested problems, urgent news, or disruptions that could not wait until morning. This is why only certain reasons were considered acceptable. Medical concerns, urgent family matters, or major life events were generally forgiven. Anything less could leave a lasting impression. Even if the conversation itself was polite, the timing alone could shape how the caller was remembered. There was also a strong connection between time and respect. Calling at an appropriate hour showed that you understood social boundaries. It demonstrated self-control and awareness. Waiting until morning, even if inconvenient, was often seen as the more respectful choice. In homes with children, the rule carried even more importance. Bedtime routines were treated seriously, and disruptions were discouraged. A ringing phone could excite or upset children, undoing the careful process of settling them down. Parents were especially sensitive to this, and they rarely forgot who caused the interruption. Work-life boundaries also played a role. Many adults believed that evening hours belonged to the family. Work-related calls during this time were discouraged unless absolutely necessary. A late call from an employer or colleague could feel intrusive, suggesting that professional demands extended too far into private life. The rule about late calls was reinforced socially rather than formally. People learned it through observation, correction, and quiet judgment. Someone who repeatedly called late might not be confronted directly, but they could sense a change in tone or warmth over time. Invitations might slow. Conversations might become shorter. Social consequences existed even without open conflict. Technology limitations reinforced this mindset. There were no answering machines in most homes, no voicemail to catch calls quietly. If the phone rang, someone had to answer it or let it ring until it stopped, which created its own discomfort. Either choice disrupted the household. This expectation also shaped how people planned their communication. Important conversations were scheduled carefully. People waited until appropriate hours, sometimes writing notes or reminders to themselves so they would not forget to call earlier the next day. Patience was built into communication. In rural areas or homes with party lines, the issue was even more complex. A late call did not just disturb one household. It affected several. The shared nature of the line amplified the sense that timing mattered. One person's poor judgment could disrupt an entire group of neighbors. Looking back, this rule reflects broader values of the era. Respect for routine, family structure, and personal boundaries was deeply ingrained. The telephone, though modern for its time, was expected to adapt to these values rather than override them. Today, constant connectivity has blurred these boundaries. Messages arrive at all hours, and missed calls are easily ignored. But in the 1950s, communication demanded intention. Timing was part of etiquette, just as important as tone or words. Understanding why late calls were discouraged helps us see how carefully people once managed access to their private lives. The ringing phone was powerful, and with that power came responsibility. Calling at the wrong hour was not just a mistake, it was a reminder that even simple actions could carry social meaning long after the line went quiet. In the 1950s, clarity was not optional when it came to telephone conversations. Because technology was limited, and phone lines were often shared, identifying yourself clearly at the beginning of a call was considered essential. Failing to do so could cause confusion, awkwardness, or even offense. A proper introduction was more than a courtesy, it was a necessity. When someone answered the phone, there was no way to know who was calling until they spoke. Caller ID did not exist, and voices could sound distorted or unfamiliar over the line. Because of this, callers were expected to state their name promptly, often along with their household or reason for calling. This practice helped the listener orient themselves immediately and respond appropriately. The same expectation applied to answering calls. Many households answered with their family name rather than a simple greeting. This confirmed that the correct number had been reached and reduced uncertainty. It also reinforced the idea that the phone connected households, not individuals. Every call entered a shared family space. Clear identification helped prevent misunderstandings, especially in communities where many people knew each other casually. Similar voices, shared surnames, or common first names could easily lead to confusion. By identifying oneself clearly, callers showed respect for the listener's time and attention. There was also a social dimension to this practice. Stating your name early demonstrated confidence and good manners. It showed that you were not hiding your identity or attempting to catch someone off guard. This mattered in an era when trust was closely tied to reputation. Unidentified callers were often viewed with suspicion. Silence on the line, delayed introductions, or vague greetings could make people uncomfortable. In some cases, it was considered impolite to ask, "Who is this?" directly. The responsibility was on the caller to make themselves known without being prompted. This expectation extended to business calls as well. Professionalism demanded clear introductions, often including job titles or affiliations. A well-structured opening set the tone for the entire conversation and signaled seriousness. A poor introduction could undermine credibility before the conversation even began. In homes with children, these rules were emphasized early. Children were taught exactly how to answer the phone and what to say. Clear identification was part of learning responsibility and social awareness. Parents corrected mistakes quickly, knowing that each call reflected on the family. The importance of identification was heightened by party lines. On shared lines, multiple households could hear the opening moments of a call. Identifying yourself clearly reduced confusion and prevented others from mistakenly staying on the line. It also minimized embarrassment if the call was not intended for the household that answered. This practice also helped maintain order during busy periods. When several calls were expected, clear introductions kept conversations efficient. People knew immediately whether the call was relevant or needed to be passed to someone else. Looking back, this emphasis on identification reveals a communication style that valued structure and transparency. Conversations followed predictable patterns, and everyone knew their role. The opening moments were carefully managed to avoid uncertainty. In contrast, modern communication often begins informally. Names may not be stated at all, especially on personal devices. While this feels natural today, it highlights how much effort once went into making conversations clear from the very first word. The 1950s telephone required cooperation. Clear identification was part of that cooperation, ensuring that conversations flowed smoothly despite technical and social limitations. It was a small habit, but one that reflected larger values of respect, clarity, and mutual understanding. By understanding why introductions mattered so much, we gain insight into a world where communication demanded attention and care. Each call began with intention, setting the stage for everything that followed. In the 1950s, a telephone conversation was expected to have a clear purpose. Long, wandering calls were discouraged, and talking just to talk was often seen as inconsiderate. This expectation was shaped by both technology and social values, and it strongly influenced how people communicated over the phone. Unlike today, where personal devices allow unlimited private conversations, most households in the 1950s had a single shared telephone. Everyone in the home depended on it. When one person occupied the line, no one else could make or receive calls. Because of this, phone time was treated as a shared resource, not a personal entitlement. In homes with several family members, this created an unspoken pressure to be efficient. Conversations were expected to move quickly to their main point. Lingering too long meant preventing others from using the phone, which could cause frustration or tension. Even without being told directly, people learned to feel when a call had gone on long enough. This pressure was even stronger in homes using party lines. A long call did not just affect one household. It affected several. If someone monopolized the line, neighbors might be unable to place important calls. This could lead to quiet resentment or, in some cases, direct confrontation. As a result, people became highly aware of time whenever they picked up the receiver. Social etiquette reinforced these limits. A caller who talked too long risked being labeled inconsiderate or self-centered. Even if the conversation itself was pleasant, the length alone could leave a negative impression. Ending a call at the right moment was considered a social skill, just as important as speaking politely. People developed subtle ways to signal that a conversation should end. Tone shifted. Responses became shorter. Phrases implying closure were used carefully. These signals were widely understood, and ignoring them was considered rude. Knowing when to say goodbye was part of knowing how to behave. The expectation of brevity also influenced how people prepared for calls. Before dialing, many people thought carefully about what they needed to say. They organized their thoughts, anticipated responses, and planned the conversation in advance. Calling without a clear reason was uncommon, especially outside close friendships or family ties. This approach made phone calls feel more formal than face-to-face conversations. In-person visits allowed for small talk and gradual transitions. Phone calls did not. The limited nature of the connection encouraged efficiency. Once the main topic was addressed, the call was expected to end. Cost also played a role. Long-distance calls were expensive, and even local calls carried an awareness of value. Spending excessive time on the phone could be seen as wasteful. Families monitored usage closely, and children were often warned not to tie up the line. Because of this, the telephone was rarely used for emotional processing or deep personal sharing. Difficult conversations were often saved for in-person meetings, where time felt less restricted. The phone was for coordination, updates, and necessary communication, not extended emotional expression. This expectation shaped relationships in subtle ways. Friendships relied more heavily on planned visits, letters, and shared activities. The phone supported these relationships but did not replace them. Its role was functional rather than expressive. There were exceptions, of course. Close friends and relatives sometimes stretched these boundaries, especially during quiet hours. But even then, there was an awareness that the call should not overstay its welcome. People listened for background sounds or changes in tone that suggested it was time to wrap up. Parents often enforced these rules strictly with children and teenagers. Long phone calls were discouraged or limited by time. This was not only about etiquette but also about control and order within the household. The phone was not a private space. It was a shared one. The physical design of phones reinforced this mindset. Corded receivers anchored people to one spot. Standing in a hallway or kitchen for long periods became uncomfortable. This physical limitation naturally shortened conversations and reminded callers that the phone was not meant for extended use. Over time, these habits created a culture of concise communication. People became skilled at expressing themselves clearly and efficiently. While this limited spontaneity, it also reduced misunderstandings and unnecessary exchanges. Looking back, this expectation of brevity contrasts sharply with modern communication habits. Today, long calls are common, and digital messages allow conversations to stretch indefinitely. But in the 1950s, communication demanded discipline. Understanding this rule helps explain why telephone etiquette felt so strict. The phone was a powerful tool, but it came with responsibilities. Using it well meant respecting others' time, needs, and access. In a world with fewer channels of communication, every call mattered. Keeping conversations short and purposeful was not about being distant or cold, it was about fairness, awareness, and cooperation. The line belonged to everyone, and that simple fact shaped how people spoke, listened, and said goodbye. Even though a telephone call carried only sound, people in the 1950s believed that appearance and behavior could be heard. This belief shaped how individuals prepared themselves before answering or making a call. The telephone was not seen as a casual extension of daily life but as a social bridge, and crossing that bridge required a certain level of readiness. Many people adjusted themselves physically before lifting the receiver. They stood up straighter, smoothed their clothes, and composed their expressions. This was not vanity. It was rooted in the idea that posture, mood, and facial expression influenced the voice. A person who slouched or frowned was thought to sound careless or irritated. Someone who smiled gently and stood upright was believed to project warmth and confidence. This mindset came from a broader cultural belief that discipline and self-control were visible in every action, even unseen ones. Good manners were not situational. They were constant. The phone simply tested whether those manners held up when visual judgment was removed. Eating while on the phone was strongly discouraged. Chewing sounds were considered disrespectful and unpleasant, even offensive. Beyond the noise itself, eating suggested divided attention. It implied that the caller was not important enough to deserve full focus. In a culture that valued attentiveness, this was a serious breach of etiquette. Background noise in general was frowned upon. Loud radios, clattering dishes, or conversations with others during a call signaled disorder. The ideal phone conversation took place in a controlled environment, where the caller felt acknowledged and prioritized. If noise could not be avoided, apologies were expected. Behavior mattered just as much as sound. Sighing, interrupting, or responding too quickly could convey impatience. Long pauses could suggest confusion or disinterest. People became highly aware of how small vocal habits might be interpreted. This awareness often made phone calls feel tense, especially for those who worried about making mistakes. In households with children, rules were strict. Children were reminded not to shout into the phone, not to joke, and not to speak unless spoken to. If they were allowed to answer at all, they followed memorized scripts. The phone was treated as an adult responsibility, one that required maturity and restraint. Adults were not immune to this pressure. Homemakers, who often answered calls during the day, felt a particular responsibility to sound calm and organized. Their voice was perceived as a reflection of the household itself. A rushed or irritated tone could suggest chaos behind the scenes, even if that was not true. Men answering work-related calls felt a different kind of pressure. Their voice was expected to sound steady, professional, and controlled. The phone connected them directly to colleagues, supervisors, or clients, often without warning. There was little room for casual speech or emotional expression. These expectations created a sense that the telephone demanded performance. Not a theatrical performance, but a controlled presentation of self. Every call required emotional regulation. Frustration, exhaustion, or distraction were meant to be hidden behind a polite tone. The belief that voices carried character was widely accepted. People spoke of voices as pleasant, sharp, weak, or strong. These qualities were associated with personality traits. As a result, people monitored themselves closely, aiming to sound dependable, kind, and composed. This vigilance could be exhausting, especially for those who spent much of the day near the phone. Some people delayed answering if they felt flustered, taking a moment to collect themselves. Others avoided making calls altogether unless necessary, preferring written communication where tone could be controlled more carefully. The design of the phone reinforced this seriousness. Heavy receivers, fixed locations, and limited privacy all contributed to a sense of formality. You could not casually pace around or multitask easily. The phone demanded stillness and focus. Mistakes were often remembered. Someone known for sounding impatient or distracted might quietly lose social standing. Others might hesitate before calling them again. These judgments were rarely spoken aloud, but they influenced relationships nonetheless. This culture of careful behavior reflected deeper values of the time. Public and private selves were closely linked. Even within the home, individuals felt accountable to social standards. The phone blurred boundaries, making the private voice part of the public world. Over time, these habits shaped how people thought about communication itself. Speaking well was not just about words but about presence. A good phone call required respect, attention, and self-awareness from start to finish. In contrast, modern communication often tolerates distraction. People speak while eating, walking, or scrolling. Voices overlap with background noise. Missed calls are common and rarely judged. This shift highlights how different the expectations once were. Understanding why appearance and behavior mattered so much on the phone helps explain the emotional weight these calls carried. The telephone was not neutral. It demanded effort. It asked people to show who they were through sound alone. In the 1950s, that sound mattered deeply. A single call could reinforce trust, damage a reputation, or shape how someone was remembered. The phone did not just transmit voices, it transmitted values, habits, and the quiet discipline of everyday life. The physical design of telephones in the 1950s shaped behavior just as much as social rules did. Phones were not portable, and their cords placed strict limits on movement. These limitations turned every phone call into a visible, often awkward event within the household, reinforcing the idea that telephone conversations were never truly private. Most phones were mounted on walls or placed on small tables in shared areas such as kitchens, hallways, or living rooms. These locations were chosen for practicality, not privacy. As a result, anyone making a call was usually within earshot of others. Family members passed by, paused, or lingered, sometimes unintentionally overhearing parts of the conversation. The cord itself became a physical boundary. While some cords were long, they could only stretch so far. Callers often twisted their bodies, leaned into doorways, or pulled the cord around corners in an attempt to create a sense of separation. This effort was rarely comfortable and often unsuccessful. These awkward positions served as a constant reminder that the call was happening in a shared space. Even when words were kept vague, tone and timing could still be observed by others. A tense call, a sudden laugh, or an extended silence drew attention. Privacy was limited not just by sound but by visibility. The presence of others influenced how people spoke. Voices were lowered, topics softened, and emotions controlled. Arguments were avoided. Sensitive subjects were postponed. The physical closeness of family members shaped the conversation, even if they were not actively listening. Children were often instructed to leave the room when adults were on the phone, but this was not always possible. Small homes made separation difficult. Even when children were sent away, their movement and noise could still be heard, adding another layer of distraction. In many households, the phone's location became a point of negotiation. Some families tried to position it as far from main living areas as possible, but wiring limitations made this difficult. Others accepted the lack of privacy and adapted their communication habits instead. The cord also limited multitasking. Holding the receiver required one hand, and the need to stay close to the phone restricted movement. This forced callers to focus on the conversation. While this increased attentiveness, it also made long calls physically tiring. In homes with multiple people, the sight of someone on the phone could trigger impatience. Others waited nearby, hoping the call would end soon so they could make their own. This silent pressure encouraged efficiency and discouraged unnecessary conversation. The physical presence of the phone affected family dynamics. It acted as a shared point of control and conflict. Parents set rules. Children tested boundaries. Everyone was aware of who used the phone most and for how long. These physical limitations also influenced emotional expression. Speaking softly while straining against a cord made it difficult to relax. Emotions were contained, not only by etiquette but by discomfort. The body reinforced the rules the mind already knew. Over time, people internalized these constraints. They learned to communicate quickly, quietly, and carefully. The environment trained behavior. The phone was not just a device. It was a structure that shaped interaction. In contrast, modern phones dissolve these boundaries. Calls can be taken anywhere, privately or publicly, without physical strain. This freedom has changed how people communicate, making conversations longer and more casual. Looking back, the physical limits of phone cords reveal how technology shapes social norms. The design of the phone enforced shared experiences and reduced isolation. It made communication a household event rather than a personal one. These constraints were not always welcomed, but they were accepted as normal. People adapted, developing habits that balanced personal needs with shared space. The phone demanded cooperation, patience, and compromise. Understanding these physical realities helps explain why phone etiquette in the 1950s was so strict. When space, time, and access were limited, respect became essential. Every call took place within a web of physical and social boundaries that could not be ignored. The cord may seem like a small detail, but it shaped daily life. It pulled conversations into view, kept people grounded in shared space, and reminded everyone that communication was never just between two voices, it was part of the household itself. In most 1950s households, the telephone was a single, shared object, and that fact alone gave it power. It was not just a tool for communication. It became a point of control, authority, and negotiation within the family. Who could use the phone, when they could use it, and for what purpose were questions that reflected deeper family dynamics. Because the phone was shared, access was often regulated. Parents decided who could answer it and who was allowed to make calls. Children rarely had free access. Even teenagers, who might have wanted privacy or independence, were closely monitored. Phone use was treated as a privilege, not a right. This control reflected broader ideas about order and responsibility. The phone connected the household to the outside world, and parents believed that connection needed supervision. Allowing unrestricted use felt risky. A careless call could embarrass the family or disrupt social relationships. Rules varied from home to home, but patterns were common. Adults had priority. Work-related or family calls came first. Social calls for younger members were limited in number and duration. These rules were rarely debated openly. They were simply enforced. The location of the phone reinforced this control. Placed in shared spaces, it allowed adults to observe who was calling and what was being said. Conversations could not be fully private, even if voices were lowered. This visibility discouraged secrecy and reinforced parental authority. For children, the phone became a symbol of growing responsibility. Being trusted to answer or make a call correctly was a sign of maturity. Mistakes could lead to loss of privileges. Success brought quiet approval. Teenagers often experienced tension around phone use. They wanted to maintain friendships and social lives, but the phone offered limited privacy. Long calls were discouraged, and conversations were often overheard. This created frustration and led some teens to rely more on in-person meetings or written notes. Parents also used the phone as a tool of discipline. Access could be restricted as a consequence for misbehavior. Because the phone was such an important link to the outside world, limiting its use carried real weight. At the same time, the phone reinforced adult responsibilities. Parents were expected to manage communication with relatives, schools, employers, and neighbors. Missing calls or handling them poorly reflected on the household. The phone demanded attention and competence. In some families, one person became the unofficial gatekeeper of the phone. This was often the homemaker, who answered most daytime calls. This role carried influence. They decided which calls were passed on immediately and which were delayed or dismissed. This gatekeeping role shaped family relationships. Information flowed through one person, giving them quiet power. Decisions about what to share, when to interrupt someone, or how to relay messages mattered. The phone also played a role in emergencies, reinforcing authority. Parents handled urgent calls and made decisions. Children learned to defer. These moments reinforced family hierarchy. The shared nature of the phone encouraged cooperation but also highlighted inequality. Not everyone had equal access. Needs and desires were weighed against each other, often favoring adults. Over time, families developed routines around phone use. Certain hours were understood as off-limits. Certain callers were prioritized. These routines reduced conflict but also reinforced existing power structures. Compared to modern households, where personal devices are common, this shared system feels restrictive. Today, control is decentralized. In the 1950s, it was concentrated. Understanding how one phone shaped family power helps explain why etiquette mattered so much. Misusing the phone did not just affect the caller. It disrupted family order. Every call intersected with authority, responsibility, and trust. The telephone was small, but its influence was large. It connected families to the world while simultaneously reinforcing boundaries within the home. Through this single object, families negotiated control, independence, and belonging. In that sense, the phone was more than technology. It was a quiet regulator of family life, shaping relationships in ways that were subtle, persistent, and deeply tied to the values of the time. In the 1950s, telephone etiquette was not viewed as a minor social detail. It was closely tied to reputation. How a person handled phone calls, how they answered, spoke, listened, and ended conversations quietly shaped how they were perceived by others. Over time, these small moments accumulated into judgments about character, reliability, and respectability. Because communities were often smaller and more tightly connected, impressions traveled quickly. Neighbors spoke to one another. Relatives compared notes. A single awkward or poorly handled call could be remembered and repeated, especially if it confirmed an existing opinion. Telephone behavior became another way people assessed whether someone understood social rules. The phone magnified these judgments because it removed visual context. Without facial expressions or body language, the voice carried everything. Tone, pacing, and word choice became the only clues to a person's attitude. A calm, polite voice suggested stability and self-control. A sharp or impatient tone suggested the opposite. Consistency mattered. Someone who was always courteous on the phone earned a reputation for being dependable. People felt comfortable calling them. They were trusted with information. In contrast, someone who frequently sounded annoyed or distracted might slowly be avoided. Calls became shorter. Invitations less frequent. These judgments were rarely spoken aloud. They operated quietly, shaping social dynamics beneath the surface. Few people would openly criticize someone's phone manners, but they would remember how a call made them feel. That memory influenced future interactions. Reputation was especially important for families. Since the phone represented the household, one person's behavior reflected on everyone. Parents were keenly aware of this. They corrected children quickly and reminded them that people are listening. The phone became a training ground for social discipline. In professional contexts, this effect was even stronger. Employers, clients, and colleagues often formed opinions based on brief calls. A well-handled conversation could build trust. A careless one could raise doubts. Because face-to-face meetings were less frequent, the phone carried extra weight. Women who answered phones during the day were often judged as representatives of their families. Their voices became associated with the household itself. A pleasant, organized manner suggested a well-run home. This expectation placed additional pressure on them to perform consistently well. Men faced similar pressures in work-related calls. Sounding confident and composed was essential. A moment of hesitation or irritation could be interpreted as weakness or lack of seriousness. Even silence contributed to reputation. Letting the phone ring too long, missing calls, or seeming unavailable could suggest irresponsibility. People noticed patterns. Over time, they adjusted their expectations accordingly. This environment encouraged caution. Many people became highly self-aware on the phone. They moderated their voices, chose words carefully, and avoided expressing strong emotions. The goal was not authenticity but acceptability. Mistakes lingered. An argument overheard, a rude response, or a careless remark could be remembered long after the call ended. In communities where memories were long, this mattered. The phone also amplified existing social hierarchies. Those already seen as respectable were often given more grace. Others were judged more harshly. Etiquette did not operate in isolation. It interacted with class, status, and familiarity. Compared to today, where communication is constant and forgiving, this level of scrutiny feels intense. Modern calls are disposable. In the 1950s, they were not. Each one left a trace. Understanding this helps explain why people invested so much effort into something as simple as a greeting. They were not just being polite. They were protecting their social standing. Telephone etiquette became a quiet test of belonging. Passing it meant acceptance. Failing it risked distance. In a world where reputation mattered deeply, even a few spoken words could carry lasting consequences. In the 1950s, using the telephone rarely felt private, even when only two people were technically involved in the conversation. Instead, phone calls often felt like small public performances, shaped by awareness, expectation, and the constant possibility of being judged. This feeling did not come from imagination alone. It was rooted in the social structure, technology, and shared values of the time. The first reason telephone calls felt performative was simple: people were rarely alone when making them. Phones were placed in shared spaces, and other family members were usually nearby. Even if they were not actively listening, their presence was felt. A caller knew they were being observed, at least visually. Body language, tone changes, and emotional reactions could all be noticed. This awareness influenced behavior immediately. People adjusted their voices, controlled their expressions, and moderated their emotions. A phone call was not a moment to fully relax. It required awareness of how one appeared and sounded, even to those in the same room. The audience was small, but it was real. Beyond the household, there was often the possibility of unseen listeners. Party lines meant neighbors might overhear the call. Even on private lines, people carried the habit of caution. They spoke as if someone else could be listening, because sometimes someone was. This created a layered audience. There was the person on the other end of the line, the family members nearby, and the imagined listeners beyond that. Each layer added pressure. Words were filtered. Topics were softened. Emotions were managed. Because of this, phone calls followed predictable scripts. Greetings, introductions, transitions, and goodbyes were structured and familiar. These scripts reduced risk. By following them, people signaled that they understood social expectations. Deviating from them felt dangerous, like forgetting lines in a play. The performance was not about deception. It was about alignment. People wanted to sound appropriate, reliable, and respectable. The goal was not to impress but to avoid standing out in a negative way. In a culture that valued conformity and order, blending in mattered. This pressure was especially strong in small communities. When people knew each other well, reputation carried weight. A single call could reinforce or undermine how someone was seen. That possibility lingered in the background of every conversation. The telephone amplified this effect because it removed visual cues for the person on the other end. Without facial expressions or gestures, the voice carried everything. Tone became critical. A slight change could be interpreted as impatience, disinterest, or disrespect. Knowing this, people monitored themselves constantly. Even laughter was controlled. Laughing too loudly could sound careless. Laughing at the wrong moment could feel inappropriate. Silence, too, was risky. Pausing too long could suggest confusion or reluctance. Every sound mattered. For many people, this created anxiety. The phone demanded emotional regulation. You could not easily express frustration, exhaustion, or sadness unless the situation clearly justified it. Everyday calls required a steady, neutral tone. This expectation was reinforced through social feedback. People commented indirectly. They might say someone sounded nice or seemed off on the phone. These remarks, though mild, reinforced the idea that phone behavior was noticed and evaluated. Children learned this early. They were corrected quickly when they sounded playful, bored, or rude. Adults modeled careful speech. Over time, these habits became automatic. People performed without thinking of it as performance. Gender roles shaped this experience differently. Women, especially those managing households, often spent more time near the phone. Their performance was ongoing. They answered calls, took messages, and represented the family repeatedly throughout the day. This constant readiness was demanding. Men experienced performance pressure more intensely in professional calls. Their voice needed to project authority and competence. A poorly handled call could affect work relationships. The stakes felt high. Even ending a call required care. Hanging up too quickly could seem abrupt. Lingering too long could feel awkward. Saying goodbye followed its own script, easing both parties out of the interaction smoothly. The physical act of holding the receiver reinforced this seriousness. The weight of the phone, the cord-restricting movement, and the need to remain still all contributed to a sense of formality. The body participated in the performance. Over time, this turned phone calls into emotionally charged moments. They were brief, but they demanded focus. People prepared themselves mentally before dialing or answering. They took a breath. They adjusted their posture. They stepped into role. This explains why some people avoided the phone unless necessary. The effort required felt disproportionate to the task. Writing a letter or visiting in person sometimes felt easier, because those forms allowed more control. Compared to modern communication, this feels distant. Today, calls are casual. People speak while distracted. Mistakes are forgiven. Calls are frequent and disposable. In the 1950s, they were not. Understanding phone calls as performances helps explain why etiquette mattered so deeply. It was not about rules for their own sake. It was about managing how one was seen and heard in a world where impressions lasted. The telephone turned private voices into public signals. Every call said something about who you were, how you lived, and whether you belonged. That weight made even ordinary conversations feel significant. In that context, etiquette was not restrictive. It was protective. It gave people a script to follow, a way to navigate risk. By performing correctly, they minimized judgment and maintained social harmony. This quiet performance happened countless times, day after day, shaping how people communicated and how they saw themselves. The phone was not just a device. It was a stage, and everyone learned their part. When we step back and look at all these rules together, telephone etiquette in the 1950s begins to feel like more than a collection of outdated habits. It becomes a window into how people understood society, responsibility, and their place within a shared world. The strictness surrounding phone use was not accidental. It reflected deeper values that shaped everyday life. At its core, telephone etiquette was about awareness. People were constantly aware of others' family members in the room, neighbors on shared lines, and the broader community beyond that. Individual actions were rarely seen as purely individual. Almost everything reflected outward. The phone simply made that reality impossible to ignore. This mindset grew from a culture that emphasized community over personal convenience. People expected to adjust themselves to shared systems rather than reshape systems around personal comfort. Waiting your turn, limiting your use, and speaking carefully were considered normal acts of respect. The telephone amplified this because it connected private homes directly to public life. When the phone rang, the outside world entered the household instantly. There was no buffer, no screen, no delay. Because of that immediacy, people treated the phone with caution. Etiquette acted as a stabilizer. It created predictability in an unpredictable interaction. When you followed the rules, answering politely, identifying yourself clearly, keeping calls brief, you reduced uncertainty. Everyone knew what to expect. That predictability mattered in a world where communication options were limited. The rules also reflected a belief in self-control. Speaking well, waiting patiently, and managing emotions were seen as signs of maturity and good character. The phone tested these qualities in a compressed moment. You had only your voice and your behavior to rely on. Another key value revealed by phone etiquette was respect for boundaries, especially time. Evenings belonged to families. Shared lines belonged to everyone. Interrupting those boundaries without good reason was considered thoughtless. This contrasts sharply with modern expectations of constant availability. Telephone etiquette also reinforced hierarchy. Adults over children. Work over leisure. Emergencies over casual conversation. These priorities were built into the rules. Following them signaled that you understood your role within the social structure. Gender expectations were embedded as well. Women often carried the burden of representing the household through the phone. Men were expected to sound authoritative in professional contexts. These roles were rarely questioned, but they shaped how people experienced communication. The physical design of the phone supported these values. Fixed locations, cords, and shared access discouraged impulsive use. The technology itself nudged people toward restraint and cooperation. Behavior adapted to the tool, not the other way around. Importantly, etiquette also served as protection. In a society where reputation mattered deeply, rules provided guidance. They helped people avoid social mistakes that could linger. By following accepted patterns, individuals reduced the risk of judgment. This does not mean people enjoyed all these rules. Many found them stressful or restrictive. Teenagers chafed at limitations. Adults felt pressure to perform. But most accepted these norms as part of daily life. Over time, these habits shaped communication styles. People became concise, careful, and deliberate. Conversations were efficient. Words were chosen thoughtfully. Silence had meaning. This approach influenced relationships, often pushing emotional conversations into private, in-person spaces. When we compare this to modern communication, the contrast is striking. Today, phones are personal, portable, and forgiving. Calls can be ignored, messages delayed, and mistakes overlooked. Etiquette still exists, but it is flexible and individualized. The disappearance of strict phone etiquette reflects broader cultural shifts. Privacy has increased. Individual convenience is prioritized. Social judgment has softened or at least become more diffuse. Communication is constant, but its weight has decreased. Looking back, 1950s telephone etiquette feels heavy, but it was consistent with its time. It matched a world that valued order, predictability, and shared responsibility. The phone did not create those values, it exposed them. Understanding this helps us avoid judging the past too harshly. These rules were not arbitrary. They were practical responses to technology, community structure, and social expectations. They helped people navigate a connected world with limited tools. In that sense, telephone etiquette was a form of social engineering. It taught people how to coexist within constraints. It reminded them that communication affected others, even when those others were unseen. The telephone may have been a simple object, but it carried complex meaning. Through it, people learned patience, discipline, and awareness. Each ring asked a question: are you ready to represent yourself and your household? Today, that question is rarely asked. Phones no longer demand preparation or performance. But something has been lost along with that pressure. Conversations are easier, but often thinner. They require less intention. By studying the etiquette of the 1950s, we gain insight into a slower, more deliberate form of connection. One where words mattered, timing mattered, and voices carried weight. The funniest part may be how strange these rules seem now. But behind the humor lies a serious truth. The way people use technology always reflects who they are and what they value. In the 1950s, telephone etiquette reflected a world built on shared space, mutual awareness, and quiet accountability. It reminds us that communication is never just technical. It is cultural. And even as the rules fade, the lesson remains. How we speak, when we speak, and how much attention we give still say more about us than we might realize, no matter how advanced the technology becomes. As our journey through these 12 ideas comes to an end, one thing becomes clear. History is not a straight line of certainty, but a landscape shaped by choices, chance, and unanswered questions. Every civilization, every turning point, and every mystery we have explored today reminds us that the world we live in is the result of countless moments that could have gone another way. What we know is only a fragment of a much larger story, and what we do not know often tells us just as much about humanity as the facts we can prove. These unanswered questions are not weaknesses in our understanding, they are invitations. They push us to imagine, to investigate, and to rethink what we believe about the past and the future. By asking what if, we do not escape reality. We deepen our connection to it. We begin to see patterns, consequences, and possibilities that help us better understand our present world and the fragile balance that sustains it. Thank you for joining us on this journey of curiosity and imagination. If this story made you think, question, or see history from a new angle, do not forget to support the channel and share it with others who love exploring the unknown. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking bold questions, and we will see you in the next episode.